The silence in the house had become a familiar companion. It filled every corner, louder than any conversation Jake and I once shared. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of wooden floorboards, those were my only sources of company most nights. I often found myself staring at the clock, counting the minutes until bedtime, hoping sleep would come quickly and take me somewhere far from the ache of loneliness. Jake wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He was just absent. Physically present on rare weekends, emotionally distant even then. His career as a corporate consultant had swallowed him whole years ago, and what remained was a man who spoke more to his laptop than to his wife. I glanced at my phone. A single text from him blinked on the screen. Meeting ran late. Don't wait up. Love you. I stared at those two words, love you. They felt mechanical, routine. I tapped the screen off and sank deeper into the couch, the glow of the television flickering across my face. The sitcom playing in the background couldn't drown the emptiness inside me. I wasn't even watching anymore. We hadn't fought. We hadn't yelled. The warmth between us had simply cooled over time, like a cup of coffee left untouched, once comforting, now bitter and cold. I thought about our early years. Sunday mornings tangled in sheets, cooking together, spontaneous road trips just because we felt like escaping. I used to feel seen, heard, desired. Now, I was a placeholder in my own home, a fading photograph on the wall of Jake's life. I sighed and got up to pour myself a glass of wine. As I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed a moving truck pulling into the driveway across the street. The house had been vacant for months, its shutters closed like eyelids in deep sleep. Curious, I walked to the window, cradling the glass in my hand. A man stepped out of the truck, mid-30s, tall, a bit rugged around the edges. He looked like someone who'd once lived in the city but had grown tired of the noise. He took a deep breath, surveying the house as if trying to decide if he'd made the right move. I watched him carry a box toward the front porch before I turned away, feeling strangely intrusive. Just a neighbor, I thought. Nothing more. Still, there was something calming about seeing someone new arrive, a flicker of life in a street that had started to feel like a ghost town. Later that evening, I called Lena, my best friend since college. Her voice brought a warmth I hadn't felt in a while. You sound tired, she said. Everything okay with Jake? I hesitated. Same as always. He's traveling again. Lena didn't respond right away. Her silence said more than words. I just feel invisible sometimes, I confessed. It's like I'm married to a shadow. You don't deserve to feel like that, Claire. I know. But it's not like he's doing anything wrong. He's just not here. That's still a kind of wrong, babe, Lena said gently. Loneliness in a marriage can be louder than any fight. I didn't reply. I couldn't. After hanging up, I sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping the last of my wine. The sky was a dark canvas scattered with stars, and the air carried a chill that clung to my skin. Across the street, the new neighbor was still unpacking, now illuminated by a single porch light. He paused for a moment, noticing me. Our eyes met. He gave a small wave. I hesitated, then waved back. It was nothing. A simple, polite gesture between strangers. But somehow, it stayed with me long after I went to bed. Jake called briefly before I fell asleep. He sounded distracted, his voice crackling through poor reception. Just wanted to say goodnight, he said. Good night, I replied, trying to sound cheerful. I'll be home late Friday. Don't plan anything. I wasn't going to. There was a pause. Okay then. Love you. Love you too. But after the call ended, I stared at the ceiling, feeling emptier than before. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself thinking not about my husband, but about the stranger who had just moved in across the street. The knock came on a Tuesday evening, soft, hesitant, almost unsure of itself. I was curled up on the sofa, wrapped in an oversized sweater, the low hum of the heater filling the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling tree branches against the window panes. The power had flickered twice already, and I was half expecting a blackout. When I opened the door, the last person I expected to see was him, the new neighbor. He stood there, a flashlight in one hand and a slight smile on his face. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "Power's out on my side of the block. Thought I'd check if you're experiencing the same." I nodded. "It's flickering here, but not completely out yet." He adjusted his grip on the flashlight. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Just moved in across the street." "Claire," I replied, offering a faint smile. There was an awkward pause, the kind that stretches just a second too long before becoming uncomfortable. "I was going to make coffee," I said, surprising even myself. "You want to come in for a cup? Might be better than standing in the cold." His hesitation was brief, followed by a nod. "Sure. That'd be nice." Inside, the house felt warmer somehow, not because of the heat, but because there was finally another voice in it. We sat in the kitchen, 2 mugs steaming between us. Conversation started slowly, casual things about the neighborhood, weather, how he was settling in. He spoke with a quiet confidence, not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that makes you lean in a little closer. "I've been divorced for about a year now," he said, almost offhandedly. "Moving here was part of a fresh start, I guess." I glanced at him, surprised by his openness. "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "Don't be. Some things just run their course." I wanted to ask more but held back. "It wasn't my place." "And you?" he asked, eyes meeting mine. "Married?" "Yes." "Jake, my husband, he travels a lot for work." There was a flicker of something in his expression. Not judgment, not curiosity. Just understanding. The kind you can only have when you've lived through loneliness yourself. "I've been spending most evenings alone," I admitted, not sure why I was saying it out loud. He nodded. "It gets heavy after a while, doesn't it? That kind of silence." I didn't answer, but I didn't need to. The power surged and came back fully, flickering the kitchen lights to life. Ethan glanced up, half smiling. "Looks like your house is luckier than mine." He stood, wrapping his hands around the warm mug one last time before setting it down. "Thanks for the coffee, Claire. And the company." "Anytime," I said, and I meant it more than I should have. After he left, the house didn't feel as empty, but my thoughts did. I couldn't explain the weight in my chest. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was something subtler, an awakening, maybe. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. I'd spot Ethan working in his yard, sometimes pausing to wave. Once, he offered to help carry my groceries inside. Another time, we stood by the mailbox talking about music for nearly an hour. It wasn't anything inappropriate. Just small conversations, harmless interactions. But they began to matter more than they should have. One afternoon, I caught myself checking my reflection before stepping outside. A touch of lip balm. A bit of mascara. I hadn't done that in months, not even when Jake was home. I tried to dismiss it, tell myself it was about confidence, not about Ethan. But deep down, I knew. It was about feeling visible again. That night, I spoke to Lena. "There's nothing happening," I told her over the phone. "He's just kind." "Kindness can be dangerous when you're starved for it," she said gently. "Be careful, Claire." I didn't reply. Later, as I sat in the kitchen, scrolling through an old photo album, I saw a picture of Jake and me at a beach, sunlight in our eyes, laughter frozen in time. It felt like another lifetime. Another version of us I wasn't sure still existed. I closed the album and looked out the window. Across the street, Ethan stood on his porch, looking out at the same night sky. And once again our eyes met. Something inside me shifted, quietly, but irreversibly. The sky was dark, the kind of stormy gray that promised more than just rain. It had been pouring since the afternoon, a relentless downpour that blanketed everything in a melancholic hush. The windows trembled softly under the wind's pressure as I stood in the kitchen, aimlessly stirring a pot of soup I no longer felt like eating. Jake had called earlier, brief, distant, predictable. Client dinner ran late. "I'll be in Chicago for 2 more days." His voice didn't carry guilt or regret. Just logistics, like a voicemail from a delivery service. I stared at the phone long after the call ended, a silent ache forming behind my ribs. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. tired of waiting, tired of pretending this marriage wasn't crumbling in slow motion. When the doorbell rang, I flinched. The sound sliced through the quiet like a blade. I opened the door to find Ethan, soaked to the bone, holding a bottle of red wine. "I know this is probably strange," he said, pushing wet hair back from his forehead, "but I was about to open this alone, and then I thought, why not share?" I hesitated, my instincts caught between decency and desire. "Come in," I heard myself say. He stepped inside, dripping rain onto the doormat. I handed him a towel and tried to ignore the way my heart had begun to race. We settled in the living room, the wine poured, the storm outside rumbling like a warning. The conversation flowed with unnatural ease, movies, childhood memories, music we still loved, regrets we'd buried too deep. Ethan was nothing like Jake. He asked questions and waited for answers. He listened, really listened. When I spoke, he didn't glance at his watch or shift in his seat. He looked at me like I mattered. And I, God help me, I basked in it. "I used to paint," I admitted, swirling wine in my glass. "Stopped years ago." "Why?" he asked gently. "Life happened," I said. "Work, marriage, priorities. The usual excuses. You should start again." I smiled faintly. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he replied. "Maybe we make it complicated because we're scared to want more." His words lingered, heavier than the storm outside. At some point, the wine bottle emptied, and the distance between us grew smaller without either of us moving. The air thickened with tension, unspoken, undeniable. I stood to clear the glasses, a weak attempt at breaking the moment. But when I turned, Ethan was already behind me. I froze. His hand touched mine, slow and deliberate. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "Claire," he said softly, a question lingering behind my name. I met his eyes, searching for some clarity, some reason to stop what was already unfolding. But all I saw was the reflection of my own loneliness mirrored in his gaze. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was quiet, gentle, the kind of kiss that asks, "Are you sure?" and answers it in the same breath. When our lips parted, I stood there trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that something inside me had irreversibly shifted. We didn't speak much after that. Words felt unnecessary, almost dishonest. We moved together in silence, guided by instinct and ache, surrendering to something neither of us could name. Later, I lay in bed beside him, the storm still murmuring outside. Ethan was asleep, arm resting across my waist like it belonged there. I stared at the ceiling, numb. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, no rush of conquest, no thrill. Just silence again. But a different kind now. Heavier. Guilt-ridden. I slipped out of bed, quietly gathering my clothes, the floorboards groaning under my steps. I dressed in the bathroom, washed my face, stared at the woman in the mirror. A woman I barely recognized. What had I done? Back in my room, I climbed into my own bed, the sheets still cool from my earlier absence. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness swallow me. Jake's absence had never felt more noticeable. And yet, Ethan's presence had created an even bigger void. I thought cheating would feel sharp, obvious, and defined. But it didn't. It felt like drifting, like slipping underwater without realizing you'd stopped breathing. And as I closed my eyes, one terrifying truth echoed in my mind. I couldn't take it back. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long, golden streaks across the bedroom floor. I hadn't slept much, if at all. My thoughts had tangled into knots, looping through guilt, regret, and an uncomfortable longing that refused to loosen its grip. Jake's flight was due to land in a few hours. I sat at the edge of the bed, my fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The taste was bitter, almost metallic, but I sipped it anyway, needing something, anything, to anchor me. Across the street, Ethan's house stood quiet, curtains drawn, no sign of movement. It felt surreal that so much had happened between those four walls in such a short time. And yet, everything still looked normal. Ordinary. as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. And maybe all of that was true. But denial was a thin blanket over the weight of what I'd done. The ache in my chest wasn't just shame, it was confusion. Somewhere in the chaos, I had allowed my heart to open again. And that, more than the physical betrayal, frightened me most. By the time Jake returned, the house had been cleaned, the wine glasses washed, and every trace of Ethan erased. At least on the surface. Jake walked in with his usual brisk energy, wheeling his suitcase behind him, phone pressed to his ear. He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, detached, habitual, before returning to his conversation. I watched him from across the kitchen, trying to recognize the man I once adored. But it was like looking at an old photograph, familiar, yet distant. That evening, he sat across from me at the dinner table, talking about quarterly reports and team dynamics. I nodded, asked the right questions, smiled in the right places. But inside, I was miles away, caught between what was and what I had allowed to happen. "Everything okay?" he asked mid-conversation, sensing something off. I hesitated. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the lie without probing further. That night, as he slept beside me, his breathing slow and rhythmic, I lay awake again. The guilt didn't gnaw at me in a dramatic way. It settled quietly, a dull pressure behind my eyes and in the pit of my stomach. I had crossed a line, and no amount of rationalization could erase that. But something deeper haunted me, an unsettling question I hadn't dared to voice. Had I cheated because I was lonely or because, somewhere deep down, I had stopped loving Jake? Days passed. I avoided Ethan. Not intentionally at first, just with careful timing and quiet distance. But when I finally ran into him at the mailbox, the tension between us returned like a ghost. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Hi," I replied, unsure where to look. We stood there, the silence heavier than it had ever been. "I didn't expect anything," he said gently, as if sensing my internal storm. That night it didn't have to mean anything. But it did. I whispered, barely audible. "That's the problem." His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I didn't mean to complicate your life, Claire." "You didn't." "I did that all on my own." We parted without another word. That night I told Jake the truth. Not all of it, but enough. We were sitting in the living room, the silence between us deeper than usual. I stared at my hands, trying to find the right words. "I haven't been happy for a long time," I said quietly. Jake looked up, his face unreadable. "I know," he said after a pause. "I've known for a while." His honesty stunned me. "I thought I was doing what I had to for us," he continued. "Providing. Building something stable." "I never asked for stability," I said, eyes welling. "I asked for you." There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just two people finally facing the truth. They had grown in different directions, slowly, silently, until the space between them became a canyon neither could cross. Jake moved into a hotel the next day. We decided to take time apart, not out of bitterness, but clarity. It wasn't about punishment. It was about honesty, something we had both neglected far too long. As I stood on the porch, watching the sunset that evening, I saw Ethan step outside. Our eyes met one last time. There was no wave, no smile, just quiet acknowledgement. Not of an affair, not of passion, but of pain and the choices that come with it. And somehow, in that stillness, I finally felt something close to closure.